Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for some of you on the US coast, and welcome to the ISF Bright Talk channel. My name is Benoit Hendricks. I'm Principal Analyst here at the ISF, and I will be your moderator today. In today's sponsored webinar, we'll be joined by Stefan Truve, a co-founder at CTO at Recorded Future, and we also have Levi Gundert, a Senior Vice President, Global Intelligence at Recorded Future as well. So very exciting webinar today on this Bright Talk channel by these two experts at Recorded Future. They will talk to us about security intelligence, predict the predictable, and manage what's not. That should be a very insightful session. We'll cover just one slide about the ISF so that you know, if you don't know already who we are. Information Security Forum. We are an international association of over 500 leading global organizations. We are fully independent, not-for-profit organizations driven by our members. We work hard to address key issues in information risk management, research, collaboration. We publish tools, practical guidance, one of them being the standard of good practice for information security, and we try to promote networking within our membership. And today's webinar is a good example of that. And before we go into the live webinar, I'll just mention a couple of housekeeping points. All listeners are automatically muted by the webinar administrator. The presentation will last for approximately 45 minutes, including Q&A sessions towards the end. You can type any questions you may have in the question box on your screen. If you have any technical difficulties, unfortunately, we don't have much to offer, so you will have to try to redial in and check your network connections or phone connection. I will now pass over to Stefan and Levi. Hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we'll also launch a very short poll as we go along. Stefan, Levi, over to you.
Thank you, Benoit.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Benoit. Appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world today. My name is Levi Gundert, as Benoit said, and I head up Intelligence at Recorded Future. So we're excited to talk this morning about risk, and specifically these topics of what is predictable and managing what's not. In terms of the agenda, this is really the high-level takeaways that we're going to be covering. So first off, talking a little bit about some of the failed paradigms or partially failed paradigms that we've seen in the information security community over the last 20 years or so. We'll talk about some of the increasing risk that's happening right now from digital transformation that everyone is dealing with in some shape or form, regardless of industry. What it means to move to a risk-driven security program. And then I'll pass it over to Stefan, who will be talking about how to understand the scoring of threats to better identify risk, and then how to predict what's coming next. So in a former life, I was with the U.S. Secret Service, and in addition to investigating cybercrime, I was also responsible for physical protection when it came up, and whether that was, the president or vice president or foreign heads of state. It was interesting working for an agency with a dual mandate, because when it came to physical protection specifically, the adversary, the potential adversary, and the tools, the tactics, the procedures that those adversaries would use in the physical world to potentially cause harm to one of our protectees, they didn't evolve, all that quickly. Meaning that once in a while we would see an evolution or a new tactic. So, for example, the advent of drones and the capability to fly longer distances with heavier payloads, that meant that drones became a pretty specific threat that wasn't previously when I first started with the Secret Service. Another one would be printing of a firearm from a 3D printer. That would be another example of a TTP evolution. But it was interesting because the way the Secret Service did and does protection, is very much that defense in depth model. And when I started working cybercrime criminal cases, this is 2005, defense in depth was very much in vogue, as a slogan or a motto. And I think there's still a lot of goodness in the concept, but in terms of the practical outworking of what defense in depth means, it works very, very well again in the physical world, but in the virtual world, in the cyber realm, TTPs, they evolve and they change daily. And they may not necessarily be new TTPs, but they do evolve very, very quickly. And so the problem with defense in depth and the way that, we used to talk about it was that you needed, multiple layers of protection, you needed multiple manufacturers, different types of firewalls, you needed different types of manufacturers within your security controls, because that was going to help, reduce risk. It was going to help improve security. And again, there's good components of a defense in depth strategy, but because things change and move so quickly in the cyber realm, the time it takes to actually implement defense in depth in a comprehensive way means that you're generally not able to adapt and move as quickly as you would like, given those changes and how quickly they happen in the cyber realm. So then, as an industry, we started talking more about intelligence, and we started talking about proactive intelligence. So this is a report that Recorded Future produced a couple of years ago, where we actually did attribution on the actor known as Tessa88. Tessa88 was responsible for multiple database breaches, including MySpace and LinkedIn and some other ones. And in this case, I bring this up as an example of where proactive intelligence is really helpful for the public sector. So for law enforcement, for intelligence agencies, for military, we're very focused on actor attribution. But when you talk about proactive versus reactive, the proactive component here wasn't really proactive. There wasn't a whole lot of relevance for the enterprise and the private sector. And so what we realized from a paradigm perspective is that, yes, you want to be proactive, and that sounds good sort of in a high level sort of way, but you also need it to be actionable. And actionable means different things to different people in different contexts. But when we say, look, we need intelligence that's actionable, what that really means is that we need intelligence that can be measured and it can be communicated. So if there's no measurable outcome that can be communicated, then it's not really going to be actionable. So again, when I was at the Secret Service, if I waited for the phone to ring and someone to report a crime, it was a very reactive sort of style. And the whole point when I was at the Secret Service of developing intelligence was again to be proactive. But to translate that into the private sector means that we actually have to be very intentional about how we think about measuring and communicating actual operational outcomes. So in this case, if we look at credential stuffing tools that adversaries are using, right? So they take those databases of stolen or compromised credentials, which we just saw in the previous slide from actors like Tessa88, and they use those credentials, millions of credential pairs at a time, and they attempt to validate, which credentials are still active and verified and valid against all types of, web services. And they use tools like Sniper and Sentry MBA. They use these types of tools to do the credential stuffing, and we know that these are the types of tools, so we can proactively see that. We can see other types of tools as well. This is just a couple of examples. But if we stop there and we say, okay, we can now see and observe what the adversary is using to attack our web application with stolen credentials, that's great. But if we don't take it the next step, then it's not quote unquote actionable. And in this case, what that would mean is, what does the traffic look like when these types of tools are enabled and used? What does the web traffic actually look like in our log data? Can we profile it? Can we determine if there's any unique elements of that web traffic so that we can block web traffic in the future from these types of tools. Additionally, can we look at modifying our web-based forms? Can we add a new field to the form, like a last name field, where currently the form requires a username and password or an email address and a password? Can we add an additional field to that form to require a last name, because most of these stolen credential databases don't contain a last name field, right? So in both cases, we're able to implement something at the operational level that, again, we can measure the efficacy of the solution, and we can communicate to other stakeholders in the organization what the change is and how the improvement has been made. So that's really what we mean when we say actionable. So then, the next sort of paradigm here was that, we need to automate as much as we can automate, because regardless of the industry that you work in, regardless of the industry type, we're all confronting the reality that there is a dearth of human resources available, especially in cybersecurity, to do all the things, right, and accomplish all the goals that we have from a security perspective. And so automation becomes so critical to any security program, and Stefan will talk more about this, and being able to automate what we can automate. And so in this example of credential stuffing, we can take it one step further, and we can say that we can, automate the identification of stolen credential databases, do a deduplication exercise, determine, which credentials are net new and original, and then do a comparison against an internal Active Directory database to determine, which credentials are still valid, and where we do have potential valid credentials in our system, we can automate the password reset process for the affected users. So this becomes an automated threat intelligence workflow that really in itself starts to function as a new technical security control. And there are many types of security control workflows that can be automated this way, and this is where this term SOAR comes from, SOAR, the Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response Playbooks. Whether it's setting up automated workflows related to phishing or other types of threats, this is the sort of the force multiplier that threat intelligence is enabling. Again, where there's a real dearth of resources to attack the problem. So now we turn to digital transformation, and as I said before, everyone is dealing with digital transformation in different ways, and whether it's moving to more of a cloud adoption model, whether it's implementing more sensor-based technology and utilizing 5G, whether it's preparing for quantum computing and the radical changes and shifts that will require. There's this quote that I heard from Bloomberg actually a couple of weeks ago. It said, "The global pandemic is an accelerant thrown on the flames of progress," and calling to mind the famous Lenin quote, "There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen." And in the past couple months, obviously, with the world grappling with COVID-19, it really feels like we're in those weeks where decades are happening. And companies that have 3 to 5 year digital transformation plans have had to radically accelerate those plans really overnight as entire workforces are moving into remote situations. And companies and CISOs are thinking about new types of security challenges and grappling with solutions. I've been talking to CISOs for the last couple of weeks on this point, and it's everything from what the virtual desktop environment looks like and how fast they can roll out VDI to whether they're going to supply printers to their employees at home for specific tasks, and whether they need to provide shredders with those printers, and all kinds of different issues that arise when you have a workforce that moves from an office to remote overnight and everything in between. So the point with this is that there are so many risks that arise in the middle of digital transformation, and the business wants to move quickly to maintain market leader status or establish market leader status and to use technology to help get there. But of course, there are all kinds of risks that are introduced to the organization as businesses attempt to move quickly and really leverage digital transformation where they can. So this leads me to my next point, which is really around the two models that I've seen. And again, I'm really fortunate. Recorded Future has hundreds of customers globally dispersed, and I'm really fortunate that I'm able to speak with and consult with a lot of our clients in terms of what they're doing with their security programs as a whole, holistically. And when I talk to folks about what they're doing, I hear kind of two different approaches to security overall. So the first one is really a compliance-focused, what I call a compliance-focused security program. And of course, there are things that you have to do from a GRC perspective, a governance risk and compliance perspective. There are all kinds of things that you obviously have to do and the business requires you to do. But if the overarching goal of the security program is compliance focused, to say, everything we're doing is about moving our compliance framework maturity, the NIST cybersecurity framework or ISO 27001, everything we're doing is about moving from a maturity level 3 to maturity level 4. The problem with that is that there is a check the box mentality that can become pervasive. And by that I mean, if the compliance framework says that you need to build a fence and you go build a fence, but you build it out of bacon, that may check the box, but it doesn't actually improve security or reduce risk in the way that the compliance framework's intended. So similarly, if it says you need to establish a 24/7 SOC, but you outsource the SOC, you build a SOC, with people that aren't really capable to run and manage that sort of SOC, then yes, you've checked the compliance box, but you haven't actually reduced risk for the organization in a very tangible way. So that's a problem. The other problem with focusing everything on a compliance framework from the top is that the compliance frameworks update maybe once a year, maybe every other year, and again they're not updating the framework as quickly as adversary TTPs move and evolve. So you'll sometimes have gaps in those compliance frameworks. And then second is a threat-focused model. And the problem with the threat-focused model, if that's really where everything is focused, is that you're in danger of wasting resources on threats that are not actually risks to your business, meaning you already have all kinds of technical and policy controls in place to address threats. And if you're constantly pivoting from threat to threat, throwing time and human resources and money before understanding whether it actually represents a risk, then again, you're potentially ignoring where the risk is, and worse, potentially wasting resources. So the alternative to those models is a risk-driven model, where from the top you're saying, everything we're doing as a security organization is really focused on reducing risk in measurable, quantifiable ways. And this is so important as a topic that's very near and dear to my heart in terms of quantifying risk, because I used to work for a financial services company, and I ran threat intelligence for this company, and we were in a position where it was very difficult to quantify risk. And the problem is that when you're not able to quantify risk, it's very difficult for decision makers to make informed decisions about where they want to spend their capital in terms of security controls and addressing specific types of risks. So the point is that when you move to a risk-driven, risk-based security framework, you're better able to communicate things like annualized loss exposure. Because, at the end of the day, The only thing that the board cares about is really, are we going to lose money? And if so, how much money? So one of the biggest problems I see in our industry today is this gap between what's happening with operational security and folks that put hands on keyboards and what's happening at the top of the org with senior executives and the board, and the disconnect. Because the board may not understand the language of technology, they may not understand the language of security, but they understand the language of risk. And again, risk is that very fundamental question, which is, are we going to lose money and how much in the context of the business? And of course, there's upside risk, right, which is there's an opportunity that we may miss out on. But in this context, what we're just talking about is loss. So if you're not able to translate what you're doing in security into the language of risk and loss, then you're really missing an opportunity. So the 3 steps here are understanding your own security controls and where you have gaps, understanding the adversary TTPs, and when the TTPs change or evolve, I call those relevant threat deltas or RTDs. So 2 halves of the equation, obviously. The one half's the adversary space, and the other half is your own awareness of your controls internally and where you have gaps. And then the 3rd step is really this calculating the probabilities and quantifying risk. And I can talk all day about this, and I'm going to run out of time here. I need to hand it over to Stefan. But so recently put out a book, and it's the same title as this presentation, the risk business, what CISOs need to know about risk-based security, and it's not on Amazon yet, unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 situation, but it hopefully will be soon. And in this book, I talk about this framework, the threat category risk framework, that's really based on FAIR, F-A-I-R. It's based on some other books on how to quantify risk. But the point of it is that there's so much uncertainty, and the way that we typically approach risk has always been likelihood of occurrence times impact. And the problem is not so much the equation, is that what we put into it tends to be, I guess for lack of a better word, garbage. So we get, we put garbage in, we get garbage out, and we don't account for what we don't know. So the whole framework is based on, instead of trying to come up with specific values, it's really about estimates and coming up with a lower bound and an upper bound and a range for any particular threat category. And then using Monte Carlo simulations, which is just taking a random value out of that range and doing it many, many times. And it turns out that when you take the median value out of those results, that it's pretty relevant and statistically significant. And what this does is allows you to talk very specifically about probabilities and loss. And what we found is that, the clients we've worked with on these types of consulting engagements is that the exercise is very practical, and the whole point of the risk framework is that it's designed to be very practical, very easy to use, very easy to implement. It doesn't take a lot of time. But the challenge typically is actually doing the evangelism internally with other stakeholders in the organization to say, this is the way that we want to talk about risk. This is the way that we want to communicate and calculate risk. And it's very different, right? Today, most organizations, they put out something like a daily threat intelligence report, and it's unclear who may or may not read that report. And the report says something like, here's a new threat. Here's where we think our organization may have some impact, right? But it's based on a very brief assessment. And they rate things red, yellow, green, or high, medium, low. And again, from experience, I know that, this is problematic because stakeholders read these reports and they say, well, what does it mean that this is, a medium? Do I lose more sleep at night when something moves from low to medium or from green to amber? And there's very generic language for risk that doesn't really mean anything. And it's very difficult for decision makers to understand what's going on. So it's really moving that model from qualitative to quantitative, in terms of how you calculate and communicate risk. So the output of the model, this is what it looks like, and it can all be done in a spreadsheet. And I don't have time to go into all the details on this, and I'm happy to follow up with anyone that would like to have a deeper conversation on this. But essentially what it shows us is probabilities, the likelihood of occurrence in a given year, and then where the loss amounts are. And again, it's a very it's a much improved conversation, again, with senior executives to talk through how you arrived at the numbers, what the variables were, what the assumptions were going into the model, and having a much more informed conversation about where you think the risk of loss actually lies in the business, based on very specific threat categories. And those threat categories can be as granular or as high level as you want them to be. These are just examples of threat categories that I've put into the model here. But it's a much improved conversation, and it allows everyone to have a better informed conversation about trade-offs and what happens to these numbers when you either change your controls or when there's a new relevant threat delta, meaning that the adversary's TTPs have changed and you haven't necessarily accounted for it with a new security control set. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Stefan.
Thank you, Levi. Great presentation. So I'm going to go a bit further here and talk a bit about what we can do about actually predicting future risks. And this will not be a super high-level company thing. This will be more technical, which I hope you'll appreciate. And really, if you look at it at a high level, the whole reason we started to report the future was that we had the idea that if we had enough of a picture of what the world looks like today, and we have enough history to be able to draw conclusions from that, we should be able to actually make intelligent predictions about the future. That's our starting point. And of course, like many have said, including me before, this is very difficult, making predictions, especially about the future. So let's see mathematically how we can go about trying to do that. And the reason we want to do this, of course, is that if you look at a lot of security today, it is very reactive. We're reacting to breaches that happened, or we're seeing some intruder in our networks and we go chasing them. And really the only way to be one step ahead is if we can predict their next move so that we can stop it before it actually happens. So one of the core concepts we're using, and I talked about that, is of course risk scoring. And essentially you could say a risk score summarizes everything that we know today. But one of my favorite statements is that we should be able, for everything where we have a risk score, we should also be able to make a predictive risk score out of it, given enough history. And of course, particularly how we do risk scores in our system. So what we're saying is that we think we can give detailed numeric numbers, but most importantly, you should think about risks in different strata. You should maybe divide them into 3 levels: high, moderate, and informational, where really the actions you take depend a lot on the exact strata these are in, not the specific numbers. And we developed a system which is it's quite sort of well-founded theoretically for how we combine different indications. Essentially, you could say that we've divided risk pools into the different strata, and as long as you just find aggregated risk within one strata, you can never move up to the next level. That really takes information which is of a significantly different nature. You can move within each one of the bands as you gain more evidence about this, but you will never jump over bands just by aggregating a lot of this information in one single band. Quick example. The other thing is here that it's one thing to provide a numeric risk score, and a lot of organizations do that, of course, but we think it's even more important to be able to show the evidence behind it. So given that we see a vulnerability, which in this case has a risk of 79, to really understand why and how you should react to that, you really need underlying evidence. So we are very transparent in how we present this. So in this example here, you can see that there are a couple of red high risk rules which are figured, and a few of the others. But I think just getting these numeric values, which you can get sometimes, is really very hard in terms of actually providing rules or advice for action. And what I'll be talking about now is how we can actually go, as I said, to predictive risk scoring. So I think many of you probably have a sort of fair idea about what machine learning is, but I decided to put in a 30-second quick intro so that we're all on the same level here. And essentially, machine learning, overhyped over the last decade or so, it's all about programming by examples. So essentially, what this allows us to do is instead of writing rules or algorithms of different kinds, it allows us to show examples. Like in this case here, we have a bunch of different states, and for each state, historically, we've seen a certain outcome. And the beauty of machine learning is, of course, that we can take the number of state outcome pairs like this, we can throw it in to a machine learning algorithm, and we'll get a black box classifier algorithm, which then allows us to enter any new state, previously unseen, and we'll get an outcome from the classifier saying whether this should be outcome A or B, as in this case. And of course, that black box can be arbitrarily complex. The big progress that's been made over the last years is really in terms of building these neural nets. Essentially, what that means is that the information you put in here, that whole state, gets transformed in many different ways, and you have multiple layers here. And essentially, what this allows the network to do is learn much more complicated patterns. And in some cases, even more complicated than what we as humans typically perceive. So that's the trick of it. Of course, that comes at a price. It means that to really train a complex system like this, you need much more training data than you would if it was a simple, smaller network. So one of the key things is really to have a lot of history if you're going to be able to make predictions. So, how predicting risk then? Well, we already saw that our risk scores came with information about the state, the rules which are triggered, and so on. And of course, you could say that why do we use rules for classifying risk? And the main reason is really explainability. So all machine learning systems still struggle with actually providing explanations for why they come to certain conclusions. So therefore, for the time being, we've decided to do the risk scoring based on rules, where each rule can actually also provide a rationale for why it's triggered and why it gave a certain contribution to the overall risk. So you could say that predicting risk or calculating risk, as we do today, we're looking at current time and we're assigning something a certain risk. But when we move over to predicting, what we essentially want to do is we want to go back in time. We want to be able to look maybe 1 or 2 or 3 days or weeks into the future and say, given what I see, what I know about the world today, what future risks can I assign to this particular entity, like a CD or an IP or a domain or whatever. And of course, as with all predictions, there is an increased amount of uncertainty compared to actually basing it on actual evidence. I'm always saying that I think you should view this essentially like when you look at the weather forecast in the morning to decide whether to bring an umbrella. You get some indication about what the future will probably look like, and given how high the risk is, you'll decide whether to bring an umbrella or not, or in our world here, to decide maybe whether to block an IP, for example, in your system. So I thought I would give 3 examples, and this again is sort of fundamental risk assignment. So this is related to how we can assign predictive risk to IP domains and vulnerabilities. And I'll give a quick intro to each of one of those. So let's look at the IP risk first of all. So remember now that for machine learning, the idea is that we have a current state and we have a lot of historical pairs of states and outcomes. So in this world, what we have is essentially we take the state of the internet, if you like. In this case, what we've done is we've used a map of all the 4 billion IPv4 addresses we have in the world. And essentially, our idea here is very similar to what some police departments are doing in terms of predicting physical risk. Don't go into this neighborhood because there's a high likelihood that you'll be mugged or killed or whatever. And our idea here was that let's see if we can do the same with IP addresses. So essentially, pictures a bit small here maybe, but if you look at a certain IP which you've never seen before and you want to assign a predictive risk to it, what you do is you really look in the neighborhood. You look at other IPs in its vicinity, and that vicinity could both be physical, so in the same city block, but it could also be that it's logically close, meaning, for example, that it's hosted in the same compute center or it's owned by the same organization or something like that. And what we've done then is we've taken historic data, so we've taken historic set lists for IPs, and we've combined it with all the contextual information we have in our system. So that includes how these IPs are talked about historically, both if they've been a threat list, but also if they were, say, discussed in similar forums, or if they were mentioned by threat researchers and so on. And this model actually learns two things. One is that it learns which are the most important features, which you should look at for IPs, and secondly, it also learns how those features should be weighed together to predict something. So essentially, what we see when we inspect the black box model here is we see that we get a model which looks at how close known malicious IPs are to the one we're investigating, but it also takes into account how these other IPs are being talked about. Which sources are mentioning them, in which way, what language is used around it, and so on. And this is a model, since of course this information is constantly changing, so we're actually rebuilding this model every day now for IPs. Just to give you one simple example here, a predictive score for one specific IP. And of course, this fluctuates up and down depending on what's happening. But as you can see in this case, we actually passed our threshold for assigning it a predictive risk score 10 days before it first got mentioned in a malicious context, in this case together with .com. And of course, this is great. This allows us to actually be, as I said earlier on, proactive and actually maybe block things. Again, this is going to completely depend on your risk profile. If you're an extremely sensitive organization, you might decide to automatically block everything above a certain level. If you're not, you might be concerned that you could accidentally block something which your system needs. So then maybe what you do is you use these kind of rules instead to trigger a human evaluation to see, is the evidence around this actually good enough that we should be blocking something, for example. So second example is to predict domain risk. And in this case, we decided to take a very simplistic approach, based on the fact that I think you can agree that we all as humans, when we see a domain, we very often look at it and say, this looks suspicious. I have one of my old favorite quotes here from Judge Porter Stewart, who said in a famous law case, I cannot define hardcore pornography, but I know it when I see it. And this is exactly the same thing, It's like bicycling also. There are things which we can do, but we cannot really explain why we do it or what gut feeling gives us about something. And this is a typical case where machine learning itself, where you cannot really define a logic for something, but you can actually, by experience, intuitively see things. So what we did in this case was that we decided to use only domain names. As I said, we as humans typically tend to be able, in many cases, to see patterns which tell us if something is malicious. So what we trained on here, we trained on about 1 million known primarily good things using the Cisco umbrella 1 million list. And then we used about 800,000 known malicious domains from our own security holdings dating back 4 years roughly. And of course, there is some overlap between these two lists because some things which have at some point been bad couldn't become good again. And so forth. And we trained a fairly deep neural network since we had so many positive and negative samples here, we could actually succeed in training a fairly deep network. And here's some example, So what we did here, what we see here, is that we could actually see when something got predicted, when something got triggered in our system for actually being suspiciously malicious. We can see that after a few days, not a huge percentage, only 7-8% here or something like that, but at least an interesting number, actually started occurring on threat lists. So, proof of this is that we got good recall, we got moderate precision, but at least we saw that by training on these examples, we could actually build a predictor which could capture the intuition we as humans had for this, which we thought was pretty interesting. And over time, what we could see was this levels after some time, but it's still enough in many cases to actually help you detect more malicious domains than you would using traditional algorithmic approaches. And actually, one thing we learned from doing this experiment was that we learned some new algorithmic rules, which we could use and are now implemented to do more traditional scoring of type of scores and things like that. So third example then, is to predict vulnerability exploits. Again, it's the same idea of allowing the defenders to be more proactive. So in this case, the idea was that there are far too many vulnerabilities published for everyone to keep track of and to prioritize patching for and so on. But we have excellent historical data again here. So what we did in this case was we trained a model. We first aligned it so that we could see from the publication time of a vulnerability up to the point where there was a known exploit in the wild, what evidence was there around it? How was it being talked about? Pretty similar to IPs, if you like, that looking at the context, the way it was talked about, which other features were involved in it. And in this case, what we found was that, and this is kind of interesting because the thing we did here, which was a random forest classifier, actually allowed us to peek into the black box and see what features was actually contributing the most to risk score. And you can say that this in one way actually confirms everyone's prejudice. As you see on the top here, if the vulnerability mentioned Adobe or Microsoft or Flash or so on, that was actually sort of strong indicator that this was a vulnerability that would be exploited. But there were, if you go down the list here, there are some other things which were interesting. The fact, for example, that if the vulnerability was mentioned in Chinese or Russian, that actually contributed to the risk that it would be exploited. Also, if it was mentioned in code repositories, so there were, for example, code on GitHub maybe that mentioned a vulnerability, which could be a precursor to actually having a proof of concept exploit, etc. So in this case, we could both do a manual validation that these features which we trained on or which the algorithm detective made sense. But again, of course, we can also look at how well do we actually do in predicting actual events. And in this case, one of the cruxes here is that very small number of vulnerabilities actually get exploited in the wild. But as you can see in this example, for a recent time period, 2 out of 5 which we predicted would be exploited actually were predicted. So whereas just 1 which we did not predict given the threshold level was actually exploited. So again, this is a tool which we could use to both decide which vulnerabilities to do deeper manual inspection on, but you could also imagine as these things evolve to actually start prioritizing automatically based on this predictive score you get. So, I think these are good examples of what can be done with this technology. Going forward, what we're doing is, we're adding more context. So for domains where we currently only look at the name, we can borrow the ideas from predictive IP risk and add neighbors, peers, historic context, and so on. Similarly, for vulnerability exploits, we're now working on adding more information, especially about not only the information where it's being talked about, but also the language use. So we're building a more detailed model where we take into account, for example, how is the vulnerability being discussed in Russian criminal forums, for example. And of course, as I said, we think any risk score which we can compute, we should also be able to make a predictive score out of. So of course, one interesting thing going forward is to apply the same ideas to company risk score, which we're also working on. Essentially saying at an aggregate level, looking at a company, what's given the current evidence, the prediction that this risk score will be going up in the future. So with that, I think we're finished. And I guess we should hand over to see if there are any questions from you in the audience.
Thank you, Stefan Levi. Benoit here. I'm back here on the channel. I don't see any questions for the audience. Anyone has any questions, please? If not, I'll get started with one. Very interesting session, very insightful session. I see, and also a reminder for our joiners on the webinar today, you can download this manual. It's very comprehensive on the risk business today. At the ISF, actually, we are working quite intensively as well on developing more methodologies on quantification of risks. And I was wondering, at Recorded Future, have you looked at any past methodologies or taxonomies, the likes of FAIR or whatever specialists like Douglas Hubbard are publishing?
Yeah, it's a great question, Benoit. So actually this book, The Risk Business, The framework here is based on the work of Douglas Hubbard and Richard Searson in their book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. So they lay out really the argument for estimates in inputs to a risk model and why estimates are so valuable in accounting for the uncertainty and the unknowns and how to do estimates properly. So this book is largely a derivative work based on their work, and TCR, the Threat Category Risk Framework, is really looking at the issues in FAIR, the shortcomings that I perceive personally in FAIR, where we have some clients that have tried to implement FAIR. They have, been at it for a number of years, but they don't have much to show for it. Generally, the implementation of FAIR is tricky, and the concepts and the ideals in FAIR are spot on. But in terms of implementing them in a practical way, we've seen some of our clients, have a really difficult time with it. I was recently at a forum with a number of CISOs, and I asked them, who has tried to implement FAIR in different capacities, and a lot of hands went up in the audience. And when I asked about the success rate and where they are, almost all of them universally said that they had been working on it for multiple years but had very little to show for it. And some of them were actually tabling or shutting down their respective programs because it was taking too much time and too much resources with very little to show for it. So that's really where threat category risk came from, was addressing those problems in FAIR in terms of the practical implementation. And that's where this book, The Risk Business, is very specific on the practical the practical benefits, right, of using FAIR in a much more streamlined way.
Thank you, Levi. Thank you. Very interesting. Yeah, I thought you might view some of this. So you're trying to deploy this very practical approach here. I can see the time. The clock is ticking. We're going to be coming out of the webinar soon. So I'll just close now. Thank you again for a very insightful session. Takeaways. You can obviously download the material, accompanying material, and please, yes, carry on visiting the ISF Media Center, Security Forum Media Center, for regular updates. We have more webinars like this one coming. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Information Security Forum, regular insightful content, and have a good rest of the day. And I hope you enjoyed the webinar. As I said, everything is on the BrightTalk channel. You can download all the material that Recorded Future has provided you with. And yes, have a good rest of the day. Thank you again, Stefan and Levi, for this session.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.